for people who already code in Rust, the benefits are, quite clear.
So, welcome, Josh. We're going to talk about Rust and Rig today. So, to kick it off, what is Rig?
So Rig is an AI agent framework that's kind of been compared to the likes of LangChain and Master and AI SDK. So what we kind of do is provide abstractions over, stuff like the agentic loop. We provide vector store integrations, as well as other useful components that kind of make up an AI framework. And we also provide observability out of the box. We support most popular model providers. We also support completion, embedding, audio generation, image generation, and transcription workflows.
It's a very complete set. So you mentioned agents there, and I saw you mention the other day that agents are often misunderstood. So how would you explain agents to people?
So I think there's just purely a lot of confusion around the agents because of marketing. I mean, literally all it is literally just calling an LLM, waiting for it to handle tools, and then just waiting for it to return like a text response, right? Like that's literally all it is. But companies are just trying to spin it as like the next coming of Jesus or something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think you summed up a lot of AI in general there, isn't it? There's a lot of confusion because there's a lot of hype.
Right.
Take prompt engineering, context engineering, agentic workflows, all of those. There's a lot of confusion those because there's so much hype, and you said people have said it's going to do all these things for us and it'd be so powerful. And they are great tools. They have a lot of great use cases, but a lot of it, from the point of view as using it, as you say, to build agents or to build a chatbot, it's actually kind of simple, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
You say it's giving it the power to invoke a tool and get some results back and give us some text. So you mentioned something else there, like this embeddings. Could you explain that as well for anyone that's listening that has heard the hype but doesn't necessarily know what it is?
An embedding is a data representation, a number representation of a bit of data, basically. So, in maths, a vector is basically a BD thing, right? An array of numbers. But what model companies actually do is that they provide models that can kind of turn, text or images or maybe even audio into vectors, basically arrays of numbers. Now, what you can do with these vectors is actually, there's quite a lot you can do, because you can, for example, store them in a vector database and query them later on using semantic search techniques, so you can find similar results. You can also use them in NLP pipelines. So, for example, clustering by topic, using regular machine learning techniques. Python ecosystem for that currently is much larger than for Rust, but the tools are there. So if you need something like, topic clustering or k-means, or, even just ANN search, approximate nearest neighbor search by for a totally in-memory process, then you can still do that. I mean, there is quite a lot you can do with vectors, and they are quite powerful, but I think they are not often as talked about because they are more niche than agents are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so what would be a typical use case somebody might use them for?
In terms of a typical use case for embeddings, usually it's something like retrieval augmented generation. So, for example, using Quadrant, a vector database that's written in Rust, right? So what you do is that you'd insert the embeddings into Quadrant, and then when you want to actually query the embeddings, then you embed the query itself. So then that gets converted into a vector, and then you query the database using that embedding, and then what it returns is a list of similar results that can also have, JSON payloads attached to them, for instance. So what you could actually do is that you can label, for example, a piece of text or do some, classification work on it beforehand, maybe even using LLM, right? And then you can kind of, once you've inserted that embedding with the payload in, once you fetch it back out, it has all those properties still, so you can do other operations with it.
Okay. And what might the end user kind of use? What use case would they use this for?
So traditionally, I know vector databases have been used in RAG and recommendation systems, but one thing that we actually use it for in RIG is called tool ragging. So essentially storing the tool definitions inside of a in-memory store or a vector database, I guess, and then querying the vector store whenever we need to make an agent request. And then based on the semantic similarity of the tool definitions, right? You can kind of, let's say you have like 100 tools, right? You might only need, two of them. So the tool ranking might only need to return two tools, and that's kind of that in that use case, it's really helpful because what you don't want is to bloat your, context window, because the more you bloat your context window by adding tools, the LLM might get confused, for example, and, do the wrong thing, which is not what you want.
Okay, so you mentioned the context window. Are there any elements in Rig that allow you to manage the context window and keep it small and tight?
So what I kind of like to do is actually using XML for documents. I know that Tune recently came out that JSON replacement, I guess, for documents. I haven't gotten to try it out recently, but in terms of that, just trying not to expand the scope too much by adding, tools and then MCP tools and then, loads of different documents. It's just kind of making sure the context window is the prompt and the system prompts are very concise.
Okay, cool. And what benefits does using Rust to implement Rig bring?
So in terms of the main benefit, for people who already code in Rust, the benefits are, quite clear. You don't have to context switch out of Rust to use Rig, right? Because typically what might happen, for example, if you're a web company and you do server deployments, right? So you might have your Rust web service, and you might have, if you need to do some machine learning stuff, you might spin up a Python sidecar service that does, some stuff with PyTorch, for instance, right? But with Rig and, other similar libraries, you can kind of do that entirely in Rust, which makes it easier to keep it to one language, which I personally find really helpful. Another thing is that you can tie it directly into other Rust code. So, for example, if you have a code in a hot path and you need to add some, reporting stuff onto that service that doesn't need to run in a hot path, that uses an LLM, for example, to generate a report, I don't know, then it can be done quite easily. And of course, all the regular benefits of Rust, the developer experience once you get past the initial learning curve, type safety, memory safety, performance. Yeah.
And how did you find that initial learning curve?
Yeah, it was rough. So when I first started learning Rust, I was actually 6 months into like trying to break into tech. So the first time that I tried it, I actually gave up. Um, And then,
Sure,
and
that's
then,
common.
yeah, maybe. And then a couple weeks after, I tried it again, and it actually worked out. So prior to that, I was kind of dabbling in a lot of different languages, and Rust was something that I thought was just cool, like the name of it, and cargo and whatnot.
So is there anything that you found really helpful that second time to get you over that hump?
I think it was mostly just spending the time to read through the Rust book. So the documentation for the official Rust language or whatever they call it, the book. I found that to be really helpful. And I think just trying to go at it more slowly and from using the domain that I was already using. So prior to all that, I was kind of like a web developer, I guess. Um, so the first real projects that I dove into was actually a web server, which I found to be quite helpful because it helps me reframe everything in a web service context, right? So, for example, Rocket, the framework, has a lot of different macros you can use. And I found while the macros didn't really help me learn Rust that much, it helped me kind of get used to just writing Rust code because, for example, just writing roots and stuff uh, was quite easy most of the time. And that was something that I found quite helpful.
So it was coming back to the book and going through it more slowly and starting to build projects in it that
Yeah,
matched the domain that you already knew.
yeah.
Cool. Did you try anything like listwings?
No, I found that the best way to do it for me was just trying stuff out and doing projects because I'm a very project oriented person. For me, doing arbitrary exercises isn't really something that I'm interested in doing. I normally just try to dive straight into something and hope it works.
Totally with you there. Totally with you there. I can't be doing building factorial functions or
No, yeah,
arbitrary exercises. I've got to get into building a project, and that's why I started coding challenges. And
for sure.
now I've got 101 projects that people can build to learn different programming languages. And I was learning less myself when I started it. Cool. So, how did you get to Lig then? Was it Lust first, and then you ended up with Lig, or was learning Lust to work on Lig?
Right. So in my previous job, I was actually a technical content writer for a cloud development platform
Okay.
called Shuttle. They're a bunch of really cool guys, but basically my role there was to basically just be a content farm, put out a demo and article every 2 weeks. The engineering team would review it, okay it, and then yeah, they'd go out. After I would say around summer of 23, we started migrating to once every week, um, which unfortunately put a lot of stress on the engineering team, but they were still happy to do it. So I'm very thankful for them because they basically accelerated my learning by 10 times, if not more. After that, I was actually brought on as a co maintainer to the Brig library for Playgrounds, the company I currently work for.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, it's been pretty smooth sailing. In April and May, they needed more engineers on one of the other engineering teams, so they had to transfer some people out. And essentially, I got made sole maintainer pretty much, mostly because I asked for it. But yeah,
Cool. I like that. Stepping up, taking some ownership, and volunteering for things. It's cool. So, am I right then in thinking that you learned List perhaps on the side while you're at Shuttle, and then that led to this role at
so,
Playgrounds and doing Lig?
yeah. So in terms of articles, they're all purely educational Rust articles. So the idea was that there weren't really very many Rust web development articles in the space. So what we kind of thought was that, okay, we should probably try to dominate this space because we want to be the leading name in the space, right? So we kind of played the long game with SEO and stuff, and branding and whatnot, and making sure that all those things kind of aligned. So it actually worked out very well for us because a lot of our pro tier customers actually initially came through that pipeline. Reading the article, getting introduced to Shuttle, and then seeing like the Shuttle branding on the website and stuff, and then they get interested and try it out.
Yeah, it's a great way to market, and if you
Yeah,
can
for
find that
sure.
space where you can stand out and differentiate yourself. So Lig then is obviously AI focused. So what brought the pivot to AI? Was that deliberate
Right.
or was that introduced by the new role?
Yeah. So, funny story. We actually tried to pivot to AI internally. Yeah, I think I'm allowed to say this. So I actually got asked to do some internal projects in Python, which we experimented with and kind of brought out. The first thing that we actually tried to write was like a coding agent. So I found that very interesting, trying to use Python. Although I think the project lasted a bit longer than it should have, mostly because I think we just wanted to try and make it work, but unfortunately the models weren't very sophisticated. So we kind of ended up ditching it and then working on some other applied AI stuff like a shuttle copilot and some other stuff. But on the side, I was also looking at building reg systems. I actually wrote my own web service for ingesting Obsidian notes from an Obsidian Git repo. So Obsidian has a plugin that you can use to sync your notes to a GitHub repo, basically. So I kind of use that fact to kind of automatically ingest it into Quadrant and then have a web interface for querying it,
Okay,
which
very cool.
I found quite helpful. Another thing that I built was like a pipeline agent library, I guess, like v0.0.1 of LangChain. To be honest, it didn't work out too well because I got stuck on some of the typing stuff. But yeah, I kept that project kicking around because I thought I might need it later down the line. I mean, I kind of did because during my interview for Playgrounds, they actually looked at all of my personal projects.
Cool. So just kind of take you back to building a coding agent. I
Right.
think that's probably something that a lot of software engineers are curious about and would benefit from understanding a little bit of how they're built. So, at a very high level, how did you approach building a coding agent, and what were the challenges that you faced with that, apart from the models not quite being there?
I think tool use wasn't quite there as well. So we kind of had to manually do all like the checks and stuff instead of just allowing the agent to do it. Uh, so how it worked was that we would have a thing where, like a planning stage, basically, where you'd tell the agent what you want. It will come back to you with some questions if it had any, and then once it's satisfied, it will actually generate the plan, which you'd then review. If you're okay with it, you'd accept it, and then it will start generating SQL code for databases and for Postgres, which was Shuttle's only real integration at the time. And then it will generate Rust code, so it will generate the entire Rust project using Shuttle's macros and stuff. And then after all that was done, it would basically just lint the generated code and format it. If everything went okay, it would try to deploy it if you agreed to. Um, if it didn't compile, then it would try to automatically fix it by itself, basically.
All right, cool. Were there any particular challenges you had with that?
Yeah. I'd say one of my challenges was that I had zero experience in using AI. So around this time, I was actually very skeptical of AI, and I wasn't very trusting. So being given a project like that was, I think, a big wake up call, I guess, because it did kind of work. So, like even though the results didn't really come out as we expected, once you gave it some templates to work with, which is kind of what we ended up doing, it was actually kind of able to adjust the templates, which was great because that meant that it could work with basic use cases and like CRUD web services and stuff like that. Although unfortunately it couldn't do like a full-on production service with like Redis and Kafka and all these other really nice things. Because I mean, that would have probably meant having to like write a template for it. And as as far as I'd basically worked with pretty much every single possible like Rust library for working with these kind of services, um, it would have taken a while to write all the code because we basically had the way we kind of did it was that we had like different versions of like feature sets being like different parts of a CRUD web service. Unfortunately, we didn't really have a sophisticated way to handle it. So yeah, that was a fun time.
Okay, so if anyone wanted to go away and try and build their own coding agent, and they were thinking of passing templates for something into it, what mechanism were you using to provide the templates to the model?
Right. Um, so we kind of got the model to output some numbers basically that equated to a feature set. So for example, one was Postgres, maybe two was SQLite, three was using Axum, a web framework, four was using Actix Web, which was another framework, and so on and so forth, basically. So we that's kind of how we ended up doing it.
How did you provide that information to the models?
Right, we provided it in the system prompt.
Okay, so you were providing quite a lot of context in the background and system prompt
Yeah,
to describe it.
there was a lot of token usage. I actually managed to get rate limited a few times because I added too much to the conversation trying to get the LLM to fix things, which was great.
Okay, cool. So how's that experience transferred into maintaining Rig then?
I think it's definitely informed my experience of building with LLMs because now I know kind of what not to do. I know that tool use it exists for a reason, right? It's very powerful, but I think the important thing is to keep your system prompt and your prompt very concise because the last thing you want is for the LLM to blow up in your face and tell you, hey, you're rate limited, because that's really bad. But also, there's a lot of system building that goes into building AI applications, right? Because you not have to only think about the AI layer. There's also data access and presentation, of course, because you have to decide whether you want streaming or non-streaming responses depending on how you're interacting with the LLM. There's other stuff as well, like the database layer, messaging if you need multiple agent systems, and all kinds of things that would go into building a traditional system, I guess.
Yeah, okay, cool. So we've talked a couple of times there about the system prompt and the user prompt.
Yeah.
For anyone that's listening that doesn't know what they are, could you explain the difference?
Right. So the system prompt is a way to tell the model directly what you want. Instructions on how it should behave, for example, an easy example. So you could tell it, hey, I want you to act, be very helpful towards the user. Or you could tell it, hey, don't sugarcoat anything. That's actually something that I've put into my chat GPT personally. Because I know it has a very big tendency to just like be very nice and almost, what's the
Almost
word?
sycophantic.
Yeah, sycophantic. So system prompts are they do mostly take priority over the user prompt. So the user prompt is essentially whatever the user puts in. This is where you'd also put your documents and stuff like that, because usually the user themselves might upload some documents, but you wouldn't do that with a system prompt, for example.
Okay, cool. Thank you. What about then prompting? What's been your experience of that? How useful is it to try different approaches from zero shot, one shot, few shot, chain of thought?
Yeah.
What advice can you give people about how they approach prompting?
So, in terms of prompting, my general advice would be to use positive language. So, try not to use like negative language that don't, for example. So, instead of saying, don't don't use a certain file, you could say you can use the following files instead of just telling it don't make any mistakes. Tell it, if you have any questions, please ask. Because one thing that I discovered and found is that if a model doesn't have a way to express that it doesn't know what the answer is, it will just it will just continue to try and do the wrong thing, which is not really what you want, right? Because the last thing you want is for a model to be confidently wrong. And I've personally seen that happen quite a few times, and that's something that I personally try to watch out for as well. The last thing I would say is very heavily constraining the prompt. So, for example, I might say, given usage of the latest version of Rig, can you write a very simple program that does this thing for me? And then I'll give it a bullet list of constraints. For example, one maybe being, you know, the program should be as simple as possible. Do not try to write like a large project, because what I've noticed is that sometimes if you don't tell it that, Claude will, for example, tries to make like a 20 file project with like modules and abstractions, and oh my god, it's too much. But yeah, those are my tips, I guess.
Yeah, I like the one on don't make any mistakes. I mean, it's not helpful to give a human that instruction, is it really?
No.
It's not really actionable because nobody sets out to make mistakes.
Yeah, yeah. It just reminds me of all those people who threaten the agents.
I haven't come across that. That's an interesting one.
Yeah,
It's a strange one, actually, because I talked recently about how a lot of staff plus skills are very transferable to AI. So learning how to communicate well, learning how to influence without authority, because ultimately there's nothing you can do to an AI model. You don't have any authority over it.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
you've got to just influence it for your communications. Interesting one. So we talked a bit about project-based learning and how
Mm.
important is that. So if somebody wants to come along and learn League, are there any projects that they can take on that would be a good learning platform?
Yeah. So currently there are a number of projects using Rig. One of them is called VT Code. So it's like basically a terminal coding agent, kind of like Open Code or Codex, I guess. I haven't personally used it, but it does seem to be racking up quite a few stars. So I guess it's seen some usefulness. There are also a number of other open source projects that use Rig that you could contribute to. In terms of examples, we do have quite a few that you can try out. Multi-turn streaming, tool usage, vector store database usage as well. We also have the flight agent tutorial. We also have tutorials on using MCP with Rig. So, for example, using a Stripe MCP to build a chatbot that can basically put out a payment link, or in other words, an e-commerce bot helper, I guess. You also have a tutorial for for a chatbot that can talk to Kraken, which is a decentralized crypto exchange for trading, right? Although if you're not very careful, I would advise not trying to liquidate all your savings on it.
Yeah, AI bot with crypto. That could be.
Yeah, yeah. Now it's funny because there is actually sort of a space emerging out of it, but I don't know what's going to become of it at the moment. Yeah, I haven't. I don't have too much experience in it, but it does seem like it's doing relatively well. Just because AI and crypto are both like bleeding edge technologies, right? So I guess there is some crossover there.
Yeah, yeah, quite possibly. I think I also saw that you had a Discord bot tutorial, so people can use League to build a Discord bot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So believe it was a while ago, I published an article with Shuttle on creating like basically a summarizer that you can use to summarize your daily conversations and then store them in Postgres and recall summaries and stuff.
Oh, cool, cool. And League itself is open source, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, we're very active. initially when I was made sole maintainer, I kind of treated it as pretty much my personal project. So I was like basically pushing. I was basically one step away from pretty much just pushing to main directly every single day. And then eventually after after like all that time had built up and I built up so many contributions, there was some other people who wanted to contribute it as well, and they did some small bug fixes and stuff, which was really great. It's really helpful when people want to contribute back, right? And then recently we've been seeing a lot more regular activity from some people. We're trying to onboard new people all the time, basically. And
all right, cool.
yeah.
So if somebody wants to contribute and get involved, how can they go about it?
Well, normally you can either contribute by opening a PR or an issue. So normally the protocol for opening a PR is that you tell us what issue you want to work on by commenting on it, saying you want to work on it. You open a PR for it, and then we'll continue from there pretty much. There isn't really too much to it. I mean, the process is relatively simple. Playgrounds has its own Discord server with a rig channel, so so people get stuck, they can come on the Discord server and get some help.
Yeah, cool. I think you're underselling yourselves there. I had a look, and you had a good contributing guide with some decent instructions on there and some comments on how to do it. And you've noted that you're open to AI contributions as well. So I think you're selling yourself short a bit there, Josh. You've got some good stuff on there about how to contribute and get involved.
Yeah, no, I ended up having to refine the guide quite a lot because we had an incident with two people trying to contribute the same thing, and then they kind of I could tell there was some aggressive like when it's kind of passive aggressive and you don't know if there's going to be an argument or not, and it was like that kind of vibe in the PR comments. And I was just like, this is not it, guys. Come on. So I ended up having to close one guy's PRs, and unfortunately, I don't think he's come back. But such is the nature of things, right? They
Yeah,
don't.
that's a
They
shame.
don't. Yeah, they don't have to contribute if they don't want to, and that's
Yeah.
fair enough.
But it sounds like you took the right lesson from it. You've cleared things up and you've refined the process to try and avoid it happening again.
Yeah, no. Initially, when it was the four of us, we all basically left it because no one really wanted to do anything with it. But eventually, I just decided to cut it out at the source, and then I added a policy that basically, if you need to basically comment on what issue you want to work on, and secondly, if someone's already taken the issue, you can't just then go and work on it unless it's very obvious they haven't submitted the PR yet. And then on top of that, seeing as we are an AI framework, we have had some people submit AI generated policies. Sorry, not policies, PRs. So we kind of had to put a policy in place that says basically you must own your code. You are fully responsible for it, and you must say that it's AI generated if it is. Obviously, they don't say it's AI generated, but you can just tell because they put the PR description is just too it's too long and it's very clear and stuff like that. And they also just put random comments inside the code itself, and I've had to tell them, look, cut this comment out. Why are you putting comments here? It's so obvious as to what the code is doing that just adding the comment there is actually not good.
You need to give them that prompting lesson of the constraints to put in the prompt.
Yeah. I don't know. I do kind of want to add a claude.md file to it or an agents.md file, but I haven't really gotten around to it. I don't use an AI IDE myself or whatever, but if we're going to be enforcing standards, we might as well have the files for it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to have to put that thread. You're building an AI framework, maintaining it, and you said you're not using AI yourself.
Well, yeah, I use Claude Web Chat, I use Chat GPT, I use Gemini Chat, but actually a lot of rig is basically just systems engineering, and you can't really get around that, right? And you have to basically be examining every single abstraction to make sure that it's good enough for the user to build on, and that will last a long time. We have actually had to do quite a lot of refactoring recently just to get rid of some of the old stuff that was causing a lot of issues.
Okay, cool. It's always interesting to hear how people are using it and how, particularly when you're building an AI tool, whether or not it's being used. There's always people asking why Anthropic and OpenAI are still recruiting software engineers if AI is going to replace us all. So you've partly answered that. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, cool. Anything else that you'd like to share, Josh?
I'm doing a talk at Rust Nation next year. If you want to hear about Rig, that's a brilliant opportunity for you to ask me any questions you might have. Yeah, there isn't really too much else.
All right, cool. And we'll put links to your LinkedIn profile if that's okay, and the link to your talk, a link to Rig in the show notes, and any other links that you want to include. All right, thank you very much for your time, Josh. It's been a pleasure learning about Lig and how you're using List for it.
No worries. It was great talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Coding Chats. If you did, please like and subscribe. And feel free to check out these other videos on a similar topic.